Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just giving everybody a few more seconds to bounce off their meetings and pop into the webinar. So thank you for your patience, and we'll get started in just about, let's say, 45 seconds. If you just joined us, thank you for coming in today. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right. Connor just updated me that he's seen a lot of folks joining. So let's get started today and get the show on the road. Before we jump in, though, I just want to thank everyone for spending your time with us today. If you're on the East Coast, it's probably during your lunch hour. And I know that most people's calendars are full right now. All of our inboxes are overflowing, and there's probably one of you, at least one of you, that's getting a Slack message right now and you're pretending not to see it. So we really appreciate you choosing this conversation today and spending some time with us. We're going to keep this really practical and really honest and really useful today, guys. That's our goal. And if at any point you catch yourself nodding along, right, we want to see a lot of that. That's a really good sign that you're in the right place today. Now, before we jump into things, I have the privilege of having a few really important guests with us today. First, let's start by introducing myself. For those that don't know me, I'm Shannon Riley. I've spent most of my career, 25 plus years, I hate to say that sometimes because it ages me, really inside of marketing teams and alongside leadership teams, which is really relevant to today's topic, and figuring out how to help translate like marketing work into those business decisions. And I had the privilege to sit right at that intersection where strategy and execution and trust really tend to collide. Next is going to be Ash Didwania. He is the CEO of Workzone, and he's going to be bringing in that leadership perspective today, which is going to be really important to the conversation. He's had the chance to work really closely with marketing teams and operators and board of directors and really understands firsthand those pressures that leaders really face today to make those decisions with sometimes what marketers provide to them with imperfect information. Next is Kendall Elliott. Kendall is the head of marketing at Workzone. She leads their day-to-day marketing function and has really firsthand experience balancing those priorities and managing capacity, working with leadership, especially Ash in this case, right, to keep marketing execution aligned with the business goals. And Kendall's really spent most of her career leading marketing at high growth startups. So working really closely with those executive leader teams where clarity, prioritization, and outcomes are really critical. And then last but not least, Connor Hansel is with us, and Connor works across Workzone's product and customer success and video communications team at Workzone. And he really partners closely with marketing and customers, more importantly, right, to translate like real workflows into product experiences. He's going to be with us today and leading some of our live visibility demo portion. So next slide, if you wouldn't mind, Connor. So if you've ever walked out of a budget meeting thinking this phrase, I don't think they actually understand what my team does. Like, this is the conversation for you, right? How many times have we all walked out of a meeting saying something exactly like I just described, right? Now, most marketing teams aren't failing. Like, that's not what's happening. Everybody is important to the business. Everybody is doing real work that matters, right? But a lot of times, trust gets a little bit fragile, right? Many times in marketing, we get questioned about our budgets. We all know that priorities are always getting reshuffled day to day, right? And usually that doesn't come down to an issue of performance. Many times it just comes down to translation, right? So today we're not going to do like a real slide heavy presentation. I don't think any of us wants to sit through that again, right? What we're going to really do today is we're going to shake it up. We're going to have this kind of guided conversation really about how marketing work gets interpreted by leadership. And not only that, but why that gap creates some of those friction points, even when you feel yourself and your leader feel aligned on all of those outcomes. So one thing I'd like to do is kind of kick it off to you, Ash, if you don't mind. Thinking of the importance of getting the leadership's perspective today from your side, like when you hear this question, what does marketing actually do? What's usually underneath that question when you hear it?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thank you to folks who joined. This will be a very candid conversation, I promise, from our end, where what we really want to focus on is bring out the actual dynamics that play out in a day-to-day basis, right? So your question, Shannon, is quite loaded. I think first of all, it depends where that question comes from, which is what does marketing even do? Is it coming from the leadership team, or is this from someone outside the leadership team? And I think that perspective is important. But speaking specifically to the leadership aspect, eventually what people are trying to understand is two things. One is, how is marketing driving the single most important outcome or metric for the organization? It could be revenue, it could be enrollments for universities and colleges, it could be patient enrollments for hospital marketing teams, right? So whatever metric has been aligned on at the company level, how is marketing driving that objective? That's first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
And then if the answer to that is clear, then the question becomes how. So what initiatives is marketing pursuing right now towards those objectives? I think those two, in essence, are what people are trying to get a sense of, including me. And if the answer to both those questions are clear, it eliminates a lot of uncertainty in decision making. It makes capital allocation a lot more easier, right? Now, if on the flip side, if that isn't clear, that is when leaders are then trying to make decisions through incomplete data, and that leads to stress, and that leads to at times miscommunication, and all the dynamics that we're all very used to by now. Now, I will say what it is not. So when someone says, or when someone asks, what does marketing even do? In most cases, I wouldn't say in all cases, but in most cases, it's not someone trying to be skeptical of the marketing team's work. It's not someone trying to judge marketing. Hey, do these guys ever do anything, right? The problem is the language that's used, right? What does marketing even do? It comes across as very condescending, in my personal opinion. And I have been guilty of using this language as well. Like I've come to you all and asked this question, which is, what do you all do, right? It can come across as condescending. So I feel there's a better way to frame that question. This is for leaders, not for marketers, but this is for leaders in the room, which is, instead of saying, hey, what do you even do? Framing it on lines of, how is marketing advancing the outcomes of the organization, or how are you trying to work toward their objectives, something like that. It's a lot more forward looking, it's a lot more solution centric. It helps marketing teams lower the guard, and you can actually have a productive conversation versus trying to feel judged, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think you bring up a lot of really good points. And I want to latch on for a second to get kind of that uncertainty comment that you made. Like, that's really what we're going to be unpacking today, I think, in this conversation. How it shows up in things like budgets, right? How it shows up in reporting, how it shows up in prioritizing things, and really how it shows up in trust. And, one of the things that I think are really important today is to really get a feel from all of you on what your experience. So Connor, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, I want to get a poll from everybody and, just pause and kind of get a read on the room. This isn't a trick question, guys. There's not going to be a wrong answer here. We see a lot of different patterns across a lot of different teams. I'm just kind of curious, like, which one shows up the most often for you. So take a look at the screen, select the option that you think creates the most friction between yourself and your team and leadership at your company, and let's see what we get for results. Looks like number 2. Are we able to scroll down a little bit, Connor, see if there's any in 3 and 4 as well?
Yeah, lots of 3, which is not
Connor, are we able to scroll down and see the other parts of the poll?
Yeah, so I have I'm seeing everything here. I'm not sure exactly how to scroll down on your end, Shannon. You may need to just
14% on 1, 32% on 2, and I can't see anything after that.
45% on 3 and 9% on 4.
Did you say 45% on 3?
Yep, 43
now.
Okay.
43. Okay, well, that's great. It looks like we're getting a pretty broad response, but it looks like number 3 is going to be the winner today. Priorities keep changing, capacity is not visible. And that one, guys, really is usually described as a prioritization problem, right? But it's really, in many cases, a visibility problem. And so when you think about like when capacity is not visible, every request is probably going to feel pretty small, right? And that's how priorities start to change consistently without, anyone intending to disrupt the plan. And I think, Ash, you talked a little bit about that earlier, some of that skepticism, some of that uncertainty, some of that clarity, some of that visibility. So thank you for participating, guys. Let's move to the next slide and really go into some of the more meat of today's conversation. And I really want to start where tension usually shows up first. And as marketers, for those marketers on the call, think about where that usually starts in the conversation, right? I can think back my 20 years, and it usually starts at a couple areas: budget and head count, right? 2 very critical things when managing a team or being in a marketing department. So, marketing teams typically put a lot of thought into these types of requests, right? But what marketing might intend to communicate and what leadership hears can be very different, right? So think in terms of, when you hear things like when marketing says brand investment, like we translate that over to the leadership side, they might hear something that is more around, this means open-ended spend for me. Or when you start talking about campaign support, the leadership side might hear things about risk. Or when you're asking for things around headcount, leadership might hear something around long-term fixed costs, right? What's important here is that these aren't really opposing views, right? They're the same problem. They're just viewed from different seats. So, Ash, I'd love to bring you back in on this topic because, as marketers, there's always a lot of requests that are floating around the company, right? And I'm sure that there's a lot of requests that probably land on your desk. So when that happens, like, what are you actually listening for? And, what kind of signals do you get to feel more confident or cautious about those requests coming your way?
Yeah, I think first things first, is the request already planned for? Is that part of our budget plan? That's the number one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it's part of the budget plan, the risk quotient goes down automatically. If it is not part of the budget plan, it leads to deeper conversations and just more questions. There's no right or wrong way about it, but I think irrespective of what bucket it falls under, there are 3 to 4 things most leaders would look for. One is back to what I was saying initially, which is alignment to priorities. Will this ask or will this request truly move the needle towards what we're trying to accomplish this year, at least in the short term, right? Now, not all requests need to be short-term oriented. They could be midterm, they could be long-term centric, but as there's got to be some level of general alignment between what the ask is and what we're trying to do over a period of time, right? That's one. Mm-hmm. Second is clarity of business case. Have we thought through all the options? And do we feel confident that this is the best path forward? Now, that is different from experimentation. Of course, in marketing, You're almost always experimenting. You very rarely have the answers available up front till you experiment. But still, has some thought gone into just a bit more research and a bit more thinking around why this could work? That's the second thing. Third piece, which is equally important, is upside and risks, right? So what happens if we hit the ball out of the park? What happens if this campaign over delivers? What's the upside then? But equally importantly, what happens if it does not work, right? What's the opportunity cost involved in that instance? What did we have to let go, or what would we have to let go if it did not work out, right? So like that's the piece. The fourth piece I feel, which is the most important piece beyond these tactical aspects, and I feel this is the one area where I've myself struggled in the past when I was not a CEO, which is communicating with conviction and confidence, right? If someone shows up having done the research and having a clear point of view of why we should pursue this campaign, even though it's something brand new and we haven't tried it before, from a leader's perspective, it's a bit of a relief, because then their thought switches from, hey, let's ask these questions to get a good point of view, to, you know what, looks like they have the shit down. Let them focus on their job. Let me get out of their way. It's a win-win for everyone. And I feel that is where a lot of marketing teams, not just marketing, but I feel in general, a lot of teams, could put in a bit more of a thought, which is not being afraid to push back. It doesn't matter if you're speaking with the CEO or the COO or a CFO, or even if it's the board, not being afraid to push back, having a very clear point of view. Leaders actually appreciate that sense of surety, that sense of, I thought through this, I know my shit, right? So that's the bottom line, which is eventually when a request comes in, what we're looking for is clarity on thoughts on the why, how, and what. Where it becomes challenging is if we don't see any connection between the ask and what our objectives are, could be short-term, long-term, or mid-term, because that slows down decision-making and it creates uncertainty. So we are not trying to be difficult in those moments, but we are simply trying to connect the dots between what the ask is and what the expected goals are, and are those goals in line with our company's organization's priorities. And if that's even reasonably clear, it's almost always a good to go.
Yeah, I think in my experience that resonates as well. I think, marketing in many cases has to bring justification, right? And when I think about like a business case, it's not really here's what we want to do. It's more in terms of like, here are the options, here are the risks, and here's the one that, we're recommending that's going to produce a measurable outcome, right? I know we're talking about a lot of outcomes today, and that's tied into that request as well. And, I think it's hard for us marketers in many cases because, teams are expected to be kind of creative and operational at the same time, right? So, marketing's always being asked to invent or execute and prove outcomes like all at one time. And sometimes that can be pretty challenging and difficult.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to what you were saying, Shannon, there, and I feel leaders need to take some accountability for this as well. Like I've made this mistake, right? In the sense, I'm not a marketer by profession. At times, it's easy for someone like me to oversimplify the ask and operate from a place of assumptions, which is far cut off from reality, right? So the one suggestion I have for marketers in the room is, if you are facing challenges communicating with your leadership team, if you feel like priorities keep shifting as the poll showed, it may not be a bad idea to actually get your leaders a bit more exposed to the day-to-day of how work flows and how work happens. A very simple example is this, right? Classic landing pages, right? I'm sure many of you get these requests a lot, which is, hey, can we quickly create this landing page for this new ICP that we all want to go after? It's the iron is hot. Let's move quickly and let's get something done in the next 2 hours. If a leader does not have marketing experience, what they are seeing is, or what they are thinking is, with AI these days, it's so easy to mock up a landing page I read all this stuff on LinkedIn, and you know what? It should take not more than 5 minutes to put something together. But from your end as a marketer, what you are seeing is storytelling, copywriting, design, layout, SEO optimization, AEO optimization. There's so much that goes behind the scenes. So even for you to expose your CEO or the leader, doesn't matter how small the company is, even to help them understand, you know what, this is how work actually flows, it will improve the level of awareness, and it will likely help you have more productive conversations with them, where you will start seeing the shifting priorities go down, because they just understand your lay of the land and your body of work a lot better.
Yeah, it's funny because Ash and I had this conversation this week. So he was like, aren't all the landing pages templates? And I think what can be really nice is walking through leadership in how something goes, or asking leadership sometimes to try themselves, depending on the case. So Ash went in after we had this conversation, and tried to build a landing page himself, and he suddenly realized like how time consuming it can be, how much goes into it, because you can't just use the template right out of the box. Nobody can use a template right out of the box. So especially if you're trying to make copy that resonates with who you're trying to reach. So
yeah, excellent point. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation, because we talked about what marketing says and what leadership hears, and that Kendall, that example is like a perfect example of how and why communication is important between marketing and leadership, right? Like Ash, you named a number of things. You said you're not a marketer, right? I think when we talked in the beginning of the call, but you just said everything that a marketer needs to experience in creating a landing page. So, I mean, that's really important. And the only way that you probably would have learned that as a leader is because your marketing team or marketers are actually communicating that information to you. So it's more understanding to you as well. So that language barrier and that gap from what marketing says and what you hear probably tightens up a lot more in those circumstances as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I'll also say this again, I'll speak on behalf of leaders. And I think I've said this a few times now. I do feel leaders need to take a bit more accountability, and have a lot more self-awareness, especially when it comes to marketing, because of all professions, of all functions, everyone believes they know marketing, right? You ask anyone, they feel like they're a marketing expert. And I've fallen into this trap a lot. So if you're a marketer in the room, your ability to help your leaders, or at least expose them to what goes behind the scenes. You don't have to have them build a landing page, but even helping them understand the various nuts and bolts behind the scenes in a short 15-minute conversation, it would make a big difference. And then depending on the leadership style, if they actually pick a passion for that and they are curious, they will themselves go out and try it and see how it works, which will go a long way in driving alignment.
Yeah. So our poll talked a lot about priorities, Ash, because marketing gets asks from probably every single department. Doesn't really matter what industry you're working from. So what, in your opinion, is a good way to push back and say no? Because in my opinion, the difference between like successful, happy marketing departments versus drowning marketing departments is the ability to say no and the ability to push back. And I think that's where a lot of people fall in the trap, right? Is that they just say yes to everything, and then it's impossible to do anything.
Yeah. So in those situations, elevating trade-offs, right? If you want me to work on this landing page, here's what will get delayed. Help me understand, do you still want me to prioritize this landing page? Right? Like eventually you got to have the leaders also have some skin in the game, which is they've got to take tough calls and they've got to make decisions, and they also need to be in the hot seat, right? I feel the one thing I really appreciate about you, Kendall, especially is, and I don't know, we've been through a journey of sorts in the last last few months of sorts, where when in the beginning, I would ping you 5-6 times every single day with all sorts of things, and then I would be like, oh, so this is all simple stuff, it should get done. But when you started asking me questions, which is, I have these 3 things which we aligned on in our last marketing review. Do you want me to deprioritize those in pursuit of these new asks? That put me in the spot. And then I was like, you know what? She's right, which is, it doesn't make sense to create this one landing page if you're rolling out this really important campaign this week. Let's have that work continue, right? So I feel that's a great way of getting leaders to become more self-aware, and it's like putting the ball in their court, which is, I can do what you're saying, but here's what we'll miss out on, and now you decide what you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Great conversation. I think it's an important topic. I hope everybody on the call is getting a real good feel as to, how this really translates between leadership and marketing, and is coming away with some really good information how to improve that conversation and that clarity and transparency as well. What I do want to do is go and talk a little bit about kind of shared frustration. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide for me, Connor, I want to pause on something that usually goes and often goes unsaid, I should say. Marketing teams always feel frustrated, right? As I mentioned just before, you guys are working hard. There's trade-offs that have to be made. But in many cases, as marketers, we're always getting questioned, right? And from the leader side, they feel maybe a little frustrated because, they're being asked to do things like approve the spend and approve the head count and the priorities. And maybe that's without really feeling very confident in the outcome. So the point of showing this is really just saying clearly, right? Both sides are frustrated for understandable reasons, right? And both are usually reacting to the same thing. And that goes back to that single word that we've been talking about, uncertainty, right? And usually what often comes next is really an attempt to fix that uncertainty. And one of the ways that we typically fix it, everybody have an idea what that can be? How do we fix that uncertainty? Well, let's go in and talk about it. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Connor, let's do another poll real quick and really talk about what describes your current marketing reporting experience. So take a look at the new poll and tell us what describes your experience. Is your leadership asking for more data? Are your reports detailed? Are metrics being reviewed? Do reports work well? And you're driving some decisions? Where's everybody at? Maybe you have to tell me, Connor, which one's winning, because I can only see down to number 3 right now.
Yep.
Looks like number 1.
Got a lot of votes coming in here. So we got, so far in the lead is the first one. Leadership asks for more data, but clarity does not improve at 35%. 18% for number 2. 33 metrics are reviewed, but decisions still feel unclear, and 14%.
38 now, yes. Well. Number 3. Number 3 is looking like the clear winner. Metrics are reviewed, but decisions still feel unclear. Yeah, and this one, guys, tells us one thing. It really tells us what data's present, right? But that context is probably missing. Leadership might understand the numbers, but maybe they just don't know, in terms of risk, what that really means, or what the trade-offs are, or what are the next steps that need to happen. So without that translation, a lot of those decisions start to stall, even when that reporting looks really solid in many cases. So this is really where framing metrics around kind of that intervention is really important and what really matters. So let's jump into the next slide, if you don't mind, Connor, and really talk about that lack of data and where teams are struggling, and really why that data is not creating that clarity or decision. And that's really exactly where many teams have a tendency to overcorrect, right? When us marketers feel misunderstood, like, what do we think? Oh, we think our instinct kicks in and says, well, we just need to report more. We just need to give more information. We just need to give more metrics, show them more dashboards, or give them more detail, right? Like that usually doesn't work, and many times that lands much worse. So, you know, what feels real thorough to us marketers can feel really overwhelming or really inconclusive to the leadership team. Not because the data that you're giving them is wrong, but because it's just for them hard to see what matters the most, right? So, you know, Ash, I'm curious of your perspective here. Like, you know, in your point of view, you know, when you see dashboards that look really impressive to somebody in marketing, like I'm looking at the screen on the right-hand side, like that looks pretty cool. A lot of good information there. They have a tendency to still fall flat with leadership. Maybe give us some, you know, perspective as to why those fall flat with leadership sometimes when people and us in marketing feel overwhelmed to give too much and sometimes way too much.
Yeah, man, you have some tough questions. Let me rewind a few years back when I used to prepare these dashboards and metrics for our CEO back then and our leadership team back then. You know, what I would do every single time was have dozens and dozens of metrics in the dashboard. And I was trying really hard to prove that I'm on top of numbers, I know my game, and you have all the data that you need as a CEO to make your decisions and to get a sense of what's going on. And I learned the hard way, it does not work. And what I learned in the process is dashboards are eventually storytelling, right? So with any good story, the first thing you want to do is get to the headline ASAP, as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, right? So in this instance, for example, what are those top 2 to 3 key metrics which gives the CEO a good sense of whether things are on track or off track? That's it. Top 2 to 3 metrics which gives the leadership team a good sense of whether things are on track or off track in pursuit of the goals that have been aligned on. Those could be, well, I won't go towards MQL, it's a discussion in itself, but let's say MQL, conversion rates, pipeline, cost of customer acquisition. If those 4 are the most important metrics that you have aligned on with the leadership team, those need to be at the very top. That's one. The second guiding principle is metrics in a vacuum are not very helpful, meaning saying our pipeline is $5 million or $50 million does not say much. Metrics almost always need, well, not almost always, metrics are preferably benchmarked against goals, or they need to be benchmarked against a time horizon. So pipeline is $50 million. Our expected goal was $60 million at this time of the year. Or pipeline last week was $48 million. This week it's $50 million. That puts things into perspective for leaders, and then they can get a good sense of, okay, does this feel on track or off track? So I would say from a pure metrics perspective, if there are just 2 things you want on a dashboard, it's those 2 key metrics at the very top. And then second, some kind of context setting around that, or some kind of benchmarking which says whether things are on track or not on track. Now, if so let's assume that those things are in place on a dashboard. If a leader takes a look at that and they're like, you know what, yeah, looks like things are on track, things are going well, then they can just shut that whole thing down, move on to the next thing. If things are not on track, then they want to explore the next set of data. And the next set of data is not, again, dozens of metrics. It's basically trying to answer the question, why are things on track? So for example, if pipeline is not what we expected it to be, why is that? Is that because a channel is underperforming? Is that because this big investment we made earlier this year did not really meet expectations? What's the why behind what's working well and what's not working well? That's it. You do not need anything else in a dashboard. Everything else, let's say you have a dashboard of 50 metrics. Beyond those few, everything else needs to go on a separate page somewhere else, which is good for reference, just FYI information, and that's about it. So bottom line is layering metrics in a way which tells a strong story upfront, that makes the job much easier for anyone, not just someone on the leadership team, but for anyone to get a good sense of what's actually happening and what's moving the needle. The last thing I'll say is, and you mentioned this a while ago, Shannon, it's a really good practice to align with the leaders on what are those metrics that we care about as an organization before you put in all the effort and create those fancy dashboards. And I've made this mistake more than a lot of folks probably in this room, because there's a sense of sense of professional pride that steps in, which is, I know we are tracking 50 metrics. Let me just put them all so that they can see what's going on. It's not helpful at a certain level, right? So it's totally worth having a 15-minute conversation with your CEO or with the leadership team and being like, what are those 3 to 4 most important metrics you care about, and then begin with those.
Mm-hmm.
I think you kind of touched what I was going to say, Ash, which is sometimes you need to take a step back before you even get to that point, because there are a lot of teams where they don't determine what success looks like with leadership before they even start. And so I find that when leadership is unhappy, it's because expectations aren't being met. And it's hard to know what those expectations are if you don't set them beforehand. So it's really important, I think, to also set boundaries here. Once you set those OKRs or KPIs or whatever you're going to call them at your organization, that's your North Star. Everything you do goes towards that. Marketing departments can be just super reactive, and that's a really good way to just keep falling behind and keep drowning. And this also goes back to saying no too, right? Like, this one pager isn't going to contribute to my OKRs. I can't prioritize this right now. So, or these are the business objectives we agreed on. This is what I have to work towards right now. It's, again, just so important for you to prioritize and really keep in mind what leadership wants there, and not just give them a bunch of things you think they might want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add to that, Kindle, again, this is for all the leaders in the room. It's equally important for leaders to set clear expectations, right? It's your job. If you're a CEO, it's your job to make sure your team knows what the expectations are and what those key priorities and metrics are, right? If you're not doing that, you're not doing your job. It's as simple as that. So yes to marketing aligning with leadership on the key metrics, but also a big yes to leaders and CEOs making sure that they communicate those metrics very, very clearly, at least when you're beginning or planning for the subsequent year or at the beginning of the year. Make sure your teams know what they're working towards. Make sure the goalposts are very clear, and that you don't keep shifting the goalpost as you go along through the year. And again, something else I've fallen into a trap of in the last couple of years, which is something's performing really well. Okay, let's shift the goal. Let's make it even more ambitious. And now for a marketing team, what that feels like is I put in so much effort to get to this place, and now you are just telling me that was not good enough. So you want me to do a lot more than what you expected me to do, right? So some of those habits creep in at times, and so I can feel like leaders need to take a bit more accountability here in terms of setting clear expectations and not moving those goalposts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as marketers, in many cases, we look at data and the reporting part to justify the work. Like, that's the traditional scope of it, right? But it's most of the time there to really help leadership decide what to do next, right? And so when that data is framed around, some type of direction or impact and constraints, like, that's really what helps build confidence, instead of a lot of that skepticism that you might see in that relationship. So, one of the things I think works really well, like, ask yourself, what would make this clear, right? What do I need to make my leader feel more confident? Or, what would I decide to do differently if it looked another way? Like, those questions sometimes can really help create some space for some real honesty without putting, anyone on the spot, because many leaders will, and you talked about this earlier, they'll say they don't understand marketing, and that's not because they don't want to learn. It's just because they don't want to maybe sound uninformed. So marketing can really help change that posture and that relationship and that communication by just, asking some of those simple questions and being honest with each other. All right. Let's go to the next slide. Great conversation on that topic, guys. Because I'm really excited to talk about a phrase that I think probably everyone on this call would recognize. And if you haven't, then you need to recognize it because it's very important to the conversation. And that is this phrase here. Can we just squeeze this in? Or maybe you'll hear it like one more thing, or, can we just do? Those are all phrases that I think we hear all the time. And, as a marketer from the inside, it always sounds like endless because the capacity, the productivity, what's happening for that week. And that just feels endless in many cases. But, from outside of marketing, if you think about your leader side, maybe it feels reasonable, right? Maybe they don't have that perspective and visibility into knowing exactly what's happening with all operational parts of the marketing department. So, let's take this conversation to talking about, low risk. So Ash, if you think about, all of these requests, maybe in your perspective, they feel low risk, but maybe in marketing, they're thinking, oh my God, I can't fit in one more thing. This is impossible. Because they hear this, can we just squeeze this in? So maybe tell us a little bit more about, why they feel either low risk or don't maybe feel like they have as much of an impact from your side.
I'll go back
impact in terms of being able to get the work done.
Yeah. I'll go back to what I was saying up front, which is, does the leader have a marketing background or not? Like, I feel like that determines a lot of what feels low risk or not. If they do not have a marketing background, it could, as we discussed, could just feel like a simple task which should be done in a few minutes because some LinkedIn post said somewhere that these days you can launch new campaigns in a matter of 15 minutes. But keeping that factor aside, lack of visibility into capacity, that's a big part of it, right? If leaders know that the team is already working on a lot of things and a lot of important stuff, there is a level of self-awareness, which is let me not burden them with more unless this is really urgent or time sensitive, right? So the lack of capacity is a big factor in those requests. Second, I'll say is, and this goes back to leadership style and power dynamics, I think to some extent, if I can use that frame. At times it's just assumed. It's just assumed that flexibility is there, right? Like, I feel like at times, we don't ask ourselves the question, which is, do they really have the time? It becomes a game of, hey, because I thought of this, it should be important. Right? And I feel at times it's important for marketing teams to show leaders the mirror, which is, it may be important for you, but help me understand why you think it's important. And just the way they ask you questions, you should be asking them questions. What do you think this will help with? And I'll give you a very simple example, which happened between Kindle and I a few weeks ago. I put a LinkedIn post out there and it got a lot of impressions and a lot of engagement. And I went to Kindle and I was like, hey, this thing seems to be working. And she's like, okay, how many leads did you get from that? I didn't have an answer, right? So in my good own headspace, I was like, you know what, let's go all in on social. But then when she asked me the question, which is your biggest goal is revenue, you need more pipeline. How much did your post actually, how much did your post generate in the last 1 month in pipeline? I didn't have an answer. Like, that made things so crystal clear, right? So those three factors, capacity, visibility, lack of just assumed flexibility somehow because it's coming from me. And third is somehow the invisible work that works behind the scene, which is kind of what skews some of these asks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think it's really important because, if you think about it in terms of like from a marketer's perspective, even the leader's perspective, like when that work is invisible, every request might feel small, right? So And when I talk about things like capacity, when that is visible, like every request will have a cost, right? And so when we think about this in terms of, visibility into capacity and having flexibility, like it's not that leadership isn't ignoring the constraints, it's just they can't see them, right? But once that capacity becomes visible, that's where that prioritization really stops being, more emotional, if you will, and starts to become more operational. And what I'd like to do as a segue to that conversation is have you go to the next slide, Connor, because I think this is the point where maybe some of that explanation that we've been talking about, stops working a little bit, and where visibility really starts working. And so instead of talking about, marketing work, let's just show it, right? So Connor, I think it'd be great to have you just walk us through a real high level, maybe get Ash to react a little bit from a leadership perspective, and let's make this a little bit more interactive now for the next couple minutes.
Sure, absolutely. Well, hi, everyone. Excited to show you how Workzone can serve as a single source of truth between marketing teams, or any team really, and their leadership team. So I'll share my screen and you'll see Workzone here. So a tool like Workzone can really help teams see what's in flight at any given time. And it really provides that visibility and fills that visibility gap that we've heard Ash and Shannon and Kindle talking about, right? Ash might think, hey, I need to request this really new important project, right? Well, on the flip side of that, the marketing team might say, well, let's take a look in Workzone and see what's a priority, what can be shifted to accommodate this, and make informed decisions. So this is Workzone's projects module. And at a glance, it's showing us every project that's in flight. We can quickly identify its status, who's overseeing each project, and its timeline. So already getting really good visibility into the work that is being done by marketing. And even still, Ash mentioned earlier, sometimes, things like creating a landing page, they sound very simple on paper or in our minds when we think about them. But when you actually look at the things that need to be completed and what's in flight, it can really help put those asks into perspective. I can see here, this is a newsletter, but if I open it up, I'll then get down to those individual tasks that are taking place and really see the full breadth of the work. So without getting too far into the weeds here, Ash, why don't you just take a moment to tell us about how this view benefits you day to day to both see the work that's taking place and communicate with marketing?
Yeah, I think this is more about visibility, to your point, and it doesn't matter whether the tool is Workzone or something else. Full context, we use Workzone at Workzone. So essentially, when we log into our own platform, we can see all departments and all the work that's happening. But I think where for me, where this plays a role is being the single source of truth, right? Even the prospect of aligning on a few objectives and projects in the marketing review meeting, and those projects now showing up here, just that notion that something went from an idea to now something that's being executed, it brings in a certain level of confidence that work is actually moving forward and not remaining restricted to conversations. That's one. Second, when I look at this in the morning every single day, I'm not looking for every single project. All I'm looking for is, what are those 2 to 3 most important projects that we have aligned on? Are they on track, meaning green, or are they red or amber, right? And if they are red, that's a good call out for me to then reach back out to the team and ask them what could be holding this back. Second, it eliminates surprises, right? No leadership team, no CEO likes surprises. I'm sure none of us like surprises. And so just having it all in one place means that I know if I log in the morning and see something as red, I just know upfront that there's something off here which needs to be fixed. So just that view is very, very helpful. But bringing immediate visibility into progress that avoids so many follow-ups. I know at Workzone we have cut down on meetings a lot. The status update meetings have almost disappeared now because everything lives in one place. And that is helpful for everyone because then we all can focus on getting the work done than spending time in meetings.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that input, Ash. We do only have a few minutes left for the demo, so I'm going to move right into just a couple other views here that can be useful in a tool like Workzone. So, one of the next things that a CEO might want to do here is really just identify, momentum, bottlenecks, what's held up, and really just get sort of a big picture view of the overall health of projects. And so reporting dashboards can really be helpful in that instance. And so rather than get into specifics here, Ash, tell us a little bit about how you're using views like this dashboard day to day.
Yeah, this is the primary view that I have set up on my side. So what this gives me a good sense of it, let's assume a marketing team with multiple sub teams. There is content, there is design, there is print, there is branding. Let's say those are the 4 sub teams within the larger marketing organization. What something like this helps me get a good sense of is which of those teams are on track towards their objectives and where do I see a lot of reds. And where I see a lot of reds, that's a great indicator to then reach back out to the team lead and have this discussion, which is, hey, I see something is holding us back. What is holding us back? Is that capacity? Do you have too much on your plate? Should we take something off? So that big picture 60,000 feet view is very helpful in having very productive conversations on where we could actually help the team members. But most importantly, it also helps us get a good sense of how the overall team is doing as a collective, not just from an efficiency perspective, most importantly, from an effectiveness perspective. And what I mean by that is, are the most important projects actually moving forward?
Absolutely. And so, Ash, this is maybe something you'd even take a look at before you go into conversations with marketing or with teams, with your reports, to really just have that conversation in a productive way as well. It's a lot easier to have informed discussions and make informed decisions when you're just seeing that stuff on paper and it's very transparent.
Yeah, you bring in a good point, Connor. And I'm slightly going off track here, but this is for marketers. Making sure your leaders come prepared to those meetings will help a lot in having productive conversations. You want to minimize time spent on status updates. You want to maximize time spent on problem solving, celebrating wins, and actually moving the ball forward, right? So it could be dashboards like these, platforms like these, or it could even be a short memo you're sending out in advance with the agenda, your weekly reports, your weekly metrics, whatever it could be. But ensuring that the leaders come to the meeting room prepared to have a productive conversation will save you a lot of time.
Absolutely. And it's tools like Workzone that can really give you that visibility and allow you to really see all that information quickly, right? You're a CEO, busy guy, you got a lot of stuff going on. And it's important to be able to intake, all of this data quickly. And these visual dashboards can do that really well. So with just the last couple minutes that we have here for the demo, we talked a lot about bandwidth today, bandwidth of marketing. And that is also easily seen in tools like Workzone, right? If I go to our workload by responsible party report, and I show the full workload here, you're seeing, sorry, I accidentally skipped back there, bear with me for a moment. But this workload report really gives you the breakdown per user on your team, how much work is assigned to them. I'm sorry, I'm showing the assigned number of tasks here, which is a different data set. But this can also show you down to the hour for each team as well. And so, Ash, while I'm turning on that other data set, I'll just hand it over to you for a moment to quickly tell us how you're using this workload report and how it benefits you.
Yeah, it need not be this exact report. Essentially, what we're trying to get here is a good sense of how loaded the team is from a capacity perspective, right? So once that view shows up, but I look at this every single day in the morning. And for me, what I'm trying to see are the reds, right? So wherever there are people who have been assigned more than 8 hours of work for that specific day, it's a flag right here, right? So if I'm seeing a lot of reds on the screen and it's specifically tagged to individuals, it means a few things. It means either the workload needs to go down or we need to hire more people. It's simple as that. And at the heart of it all is how can we all operate without burning out teams, right? That's a big part of eventually what workload is about, is to making sure that it's not just about the numbers and the metrics, it's equally about people's mental health and about their own well-being. And something like this gives me a very good sense of, if you're seeing a lot of reds across the board, it just means that this team is overloaded with stuff, which means something needs to change. If it's happening for a couple of individuals, it means that maybe there is need for workload balancing. But great report to essentially make decisions on hiring or deciding on work bandwidth in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the marketing side, this can be a great report to make informed decisions on if you have the bandwidth to take on additional work, right? I might say, we're seeing a lot of red this week, but things clear up for us in the coming weeks, and we can look to take those projects on at that time. Great. Yeah. Well, I don't want to ask anything else to add there.
No, I will just end by saying it doesn't matter what platform you use. Point here is driving visibility through data, making sure your leaders have a single source of truth that they can refer to whenever they have questions. And it helps you cut down meetings. It helps cut down a lot of follow-ups that usually happen on a day-to-day basis. So make sure you have the single source of truth somewhere, and make sure you share that with your leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when we hear or when we've been involved in conversations from marketers in the past, like we've always had to defend ourselves, right? But I think this provided a really good example, Connor, of like when you can see the work, the priorities, all the constraints, like you don't have to defend yourself as much, right? Because it's right in front of you, and it's very clear. That clarity is no clearer than it is when it's right in front visually on the screen. So, from a marketer's perspective, guys, like that's where that conversation really shifts from like explaining yourselves to being able to drive more decisions. So I think it was really important and nice to see the demo. So thank you for sharing that with us, Connor. What I'd like to do next is utilize the last few minutes or so that we have for some questions. So Connor, did you have any questions come into the chat or anything that?
Not at this time. No questions yet.
Okay, so guys, we're going to open this up for questions. Feel free to type your question in the chat, and we'll have one of us who it's related to respond.
I see one, and it's a great question. What's the one thing you would recommend to a marketing leader to have more productive conversations with the leadership team? I would say it's showing up with conviction and confidence. Honestly, like we can leave aside all the metrics, we can leave aside all the projects, we can leave aside PM platforms and everything else around that. If you show up in a room sounding confident, having done your research, having thought through what you want to propose and how you want to run the show, that's half the job done right there, because CEOs will have a lot more things they're dealing with, and what they're trying to almost always look for is, what do I not need to worry about? And that not need to worry about piece comes a lot with the way you communicate and the way you show up, right? So if at all you want to take away one thing from this call, it would be that.
Yeah, great question. I got one sent for marketing. And they asked, if marketing could show leadership just one thing to build trust, what should it be? That's a great question. It's always hard to narrow it down to one, I think, but I think if I had to pick one thing, especially with what Connor showed on the demo, like that work in flight, that large visual that shows like all the ownership, and then probably the capacity tied with it, right? So, we saw dashboards, there's a lot of stuff on there. I would stick with ownership and capacity, because knowing what's happening, who owns it, and what's constrained, like that's really important. Like that view that Connor showed really turns marketing from that black box into more of an operating system. And once leadership starts to see that and gets that visibility, like that's where that conversation shifts from questioning what marketing's doing to more to prioritizing, which you can do based on some of those dependencies and variables. Anyone else have any questions they want to share? I know we're at the top of the hour, so one of the things we'll probably want to do is wrap up. And if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to us and ask us. We're going to have this webinar sent as a recording after, but yeah, feel free to reach out to us, ask us questions. We're more than happy to answer it. I wanted to go to the last slide because I want to wrap things up and just really kind of pull together real quickly what we heard today. And that really is that marketing and leadership are rarely in conflict about goals. They're usually reacting from the same pressures and just at different angles, right? We're trying to create and execute and deliver outcomes at the same time, right? But leadership's really just trying to manage those risks and those priorities and timing, and with that limited visibility they have. And when those two worlds like don't share the same view of work, that's where that friction shows up in the reporting, in that prioritization, in that trust. And what we really saw in that demo that Connor shared today is where visibility changes that conversation. Like, as I talked about, I think it was the very first slide, marketing usually isn't the problem, right? When leadership has the visibility into the work and what those priorities are and the trade-offs, like trust will start to follow along with that. And you don't really need to explain marketing better. You just need to make it easier to see. So I really want to thank everyone for spending time with us today. We appreciate all of the questions, the honesty, and all of the conversation today. Look for that video recording to come out. Feel free to ask us questions. We're all in LinkedIn, and we'll be happy to answer those for you. Thank you for your time, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, folks.
And thank you, I should say, to all of our guest speakers today as well for joining us today and giving their perspective. So thank you guys. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Shannon. This was fun.
Thank you.